You're unmuted.
Okay, everyone. So sorry for the interruption. We are back, and Ms. Elisa Somera has very graciously agreed to help us by clerking this committee meeting. So we were at the point of asking Madam Clerk if you had any announcements.
Yes, Madam Chair. The Board of Supervisors and its committees are now convening hybrid meetings that allow in-person attendance and public comment while still providing remote access and public comment via telephone. Public comment will be taken on each item on this agenda. Those attending in person will be allowed to speak first, and then we will go to those joining us on the telephone line. When your item of interest comes up, please dial *3 to be added to the speaker line if you are joining us remotely. You may also submit public comment in writing in either of the following ways: to the Land Use and Transportation Clerk at erica, erica.major, major, @sfgov.org, or you may submit written comments via the U.S. Postal Service at City Hall, 1 Dr. Carlton B. Goodlett Place, Room 244, San Francisco, California, 94102. Finally, items acted upon today are expected to appear on the Board of Supervisors' agenda of June 13th, 2023, unless otherwise stated.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. Please call item number 1.
Yes, item number 1 is amendments to the Planning Code to designate the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples at 2041 Larkin Street as a landmark consistent with standards set forth in Article 10 of the Planning Code.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. President Peskin, thank you for introducing this item. Before we have Pilar LaValle come up and make the presentation, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Chair Melgar. I actually wanted to thank Planning Department staff and the Historic Preservation Commission, as well as the community, for making this part of the Historic Preservation Commission's work plan a number of years ago. The preparation of really a phenomenal case report that, for some reason, we now call fact sheets, and am delighted to be the sponsor and invite you, colleagues, to add your names as well, if you so desire, to the designation of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples that, since 1949, has been at 2041 Larkin Street for not only its architectural significance, but more importantly, for its significance with the Thurmans. Mr. and Mrs. Thurman, as really the first interracial church in San Francisco with a storied history that is all laid out really in a wonderful way. Particularly, I knew about Dr. Thurman. I did not know about Sue Bailey Thurman. So for anybody who has not read the case report, I commend you to do so.
Thank you, President. So we now have a presentation from planning staff. Welcome, Ms. LaValle.
Thank you. Thank you, Supervisors. Pilar LaValle Planning Department staff. Just 1 minute, I'll pull some slides up here. So good afternoon. Thank you, Supervisor Peskin and Chair Mulgar, for the opportunity to speak on this pending landmark designation. As just was mentioned, the department has been pleased to work in collaboration with the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples Board of Trustees on this designation, which the Historic Preservation Commission initiated for designation on March 1, 2023. And then followed that up with a resolution recommending approval in April of 2023. The church is located at 2041 Larkin Street since 1949. The church was co-founded by Dr. Alfred Fisk, a white Presbyterian minister and professor of philosophy at SF State, and with Dr. Howard Thurman, a Black Baptist minister and religious scholar, in 1944. The Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples is culturally and historically significant as one of the first interracial, intercultural, and interdenominational churches in the United States. It is representative of African American social, cultural, and intellectual life, and with the struggle for integration and civil rights. The Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples is also significant, as mentioned, for its association with Dr. Howard Thurman and his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman. Dr. Howard Thurman was a nationally prominent African-American theologian and religious scholar who was identified in Life magazine as one of the 12 greatest preachers of the 20th century. His influence as a philosopher, theologian, educator, author, minister, counselor, and civil rights leader continues today. As I mentioned, Dr. Thurman co-founded the church and served as its minister from 1944 to 1953 before returning to academia. Among many aspects of a noteworthy life, Dr. Thurman was one of the principal intellectual influences shaping the modern nonviolent civil rights movement. His wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, was an author, editor, lecturer, historian, and community organizer. Renowned for her efforts to integrate and progress the lives of Black women, her work to archive and celebrate African American heritage, and for her advocacy of interracial, intercultural, and international understanding to support universal emancipation. At their hearing, the Historic Preservation Commission heard public comments in support of designation and voted unanimously to approve a resolution recommending landmarking of the subject property, finding that the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples meets established eligibility requirements and that landmark status is warranted. Thank you for your time. That completes my presentation.
Thank you so much, Ms. LaValle. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Okay, with that, let's go to public comment, Madam Clerk.
Okay, members of the public who wish to comment on this item, if you're joining us in person, please line up against the curtains or come forward. All speakers will be provided 2 minutes. If you're joining us online, please don't forget to press *3 to line up to speak. Go ahead.
I'm Dr. Dorsey Blake, the presiding minister of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. I'm very pleased to be here today and very pleased with your work. This has been a dream for Fellowship Church for many, many years. Mrs. Sue Bailey Thurman, one of the founders of the church and again the spouse of Dr. Howard Thurman, thought about this on and off over the years. She died here in San Francisco in 1996 on Christmas Day at the Buddhist Hospice on Page Street. And one of the things she said to me in that year before she passed was to work on trying to get the church landmark. So I know that she would be very pleased with what is happening right now. I want to say a special thank you to Pierre LaValle, who has worked so diligently and for her efficiency, and she has been a blessing to us. Her spirit has just been enormous. And I also want to thank the Preservation Committee for its affirmation of this landmarking, and I want to thank you, supervisors, for hearing us today. I'm just amazed that this is happening, and so very, very grateful. What you're doing is to continue the growing legacy of Dr. Howard Thurman. In the last several years, more books have been written on Dr. Howard Thurman, I believe, than any other religious scholar. You've read the documents where he's been honored in memorials and many places in the United States. So I want to say to you personally, as the presiding minister of the church, that I appreciate you so very, very much. Truly grateful. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Do we have any other speakers in person?
Hello, my name is Peter Fitzsimmons. I'm born and raised in San Francisco. It's good to see my good friend, President Aaron Peskin, as well as Dean Preston. I wanted to just tell you a little story really quickly. Saturday, I went to a estate sale of Rita Moreno, and I walked through her house in the Berkeley Hills and was amazed by the artifacts and the gadgets and gizmos that she'd collected all of her life, and they were now for sale. I couldn't find anything that I could afford, but I found this book. This book is like one of those journal kind of books with the blank pages. So I wrote on the first page, "Today is the first day of the rest of my life." I wrote on the second line, "Dr. Howard Thurman, historic landmark status. Board of Soups, President Aaron Peskin, and others in room 250, City Hall." And then I wrote down the word testimony memories. So, 1958, I was 8 years old, and I attended the Fellowship Church of All Peoples in their church school. And occasionally we were allowed to come upstairs from the basement where they kept us at church school to hear Dr. Howard Thurman speak. And it was always mesmerizing, and at that young age, I was quite confused. But I knew I was in the presence of somebody great, and we were always privileged to be up in the sanctuary to hear him speak. In the 1960s, my mom was a member of the choir, Fellowship Church Choir. My mother, Patricia Nacy Skillicorn, who later worked for Wilbur Hamilton in the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. And she would take me to church pretty consistently on Sundays to Fellowship Church. In the 70s, she also promoted jazz concerts, which would honor my dad, F. Allen Smith, and Marvin Chandler, who was the minister at the time, and we'd have free jazz concerts at Fellowship Church. In the 80s, it was Sue Bailey.
Your comments.
Finish? Sue Bailey gave me the opportunity to find and found the Fellowship Theater Guild. And once again, it's just a pleasure to be here in this great moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comments. Do we have any other in-person speakers? Please come forward. If there are any other in-person speakers, if you could please line up to your right, my left. Please proceed.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Leeds. I come to hearings often, and I'm very happy. And I see Supervisor Preston here, who I know well. I want to just express appreciation to all of you. I came to Fellowship Church 7 years ago, and I had been to other faith communities, and I never saw a more welcoming community. And I just wanted to thank all of you, and I also see Supervisor Melgar here, and I live in D7, so I want to thank all of you for what you did. Thank you so much, and I'm not taking my whole minute for a change.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Do we have any other speakers in person? Seeing no one, we will go to our public comment line. We have Kalina Mendoza monitoring the remote line. Ms. Mendoza, could you please put the first caller forward?
Hi, my name is Aaron Grizel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation. Just wanted to commend the Board of Supervisors and the Land Use Committee for its work here in what we hope to be a really special occasion for the church and a really special time for the church. Just wanted to say just a few brief words. As many of you may already know, Dr. Thurman was one of the major mentors for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But there was so much more to his work around the country and around the world. In 1953, at the invite of Boston University to become the dean of chapel at that university, the first African American to be a dean in a predominantly white university, he wrote to the board of directors, the board of trustees at the church, mentioning how he wanted to take the model of Fellowship Church and expand it to see if it would work in a larger setting, to build this idea of community that had been thought about and that had been worked through so arduously and so dedicatedly at Fellowship Church, to place that on top of an academic setting to bring community to the academy. That legacy still lives on today at that university and in universities around the country and around the world. And so the importance of what you're doing today is something that will resound and redound to the benefit not only of this city, but also around the country, to let folks know that Howard Thurman and the work of Fellowship Church is important in the legacy of the United States.
Thank you for your comments. Can we have the next caller, please? Hello, caller?
Yes.
Please proceed.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Brian Caston. I'm the chairperson for the Board of Trustees for the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. I'd like to thank the Board of Supervisors for taking up this issue, thank everyone who has worked on it, and we just thank you for taking the time to deal with the landmarking of the church.
Thank you for your comments. Do we have any other callers? Thank you. Madam Chair, there are no more callers.
Thank you very much. Public comment is not closed. President Peskin, did you have any closing remarks?
After Supervisor Preston, I would be more than delighted to send this to the full Board of Supervisors with a positive recommendation.
Thank you. I apologize, Supervisor President. I didn't see your name.
No problem, and no comments except to say that when you forward this to the board, it will be with me as a co-sponsor. So please add me as a co-sponsor. Thank you for your leadership on this, President Peskin.
Thank you, and me as well, President Peskin.
Thank you, colleagues. And I just really want to shout out Pilar for her incredible case report, as well as the community that has long sought the appropriate recognition for this edifice and everything that has happened over now getting on the 3/4 of a century since Dr. Howard Thurman and Dr. Fisk first founded it.
Thank you, President Peskin. Madam Clerk, if you could take roll on the motion, please.
On the motion to recommend the ordinance, Vice Chair Preston.
Aye.
Preston, aye. Member Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Chair Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. There are 3 ayes.
Thank you. That motion passes. Congratulations. Okay, Madam Clerk, let's go to item number 2, please.
Item number 2 are amendments to the planning and building codes regarding commercial to residential adaptive reuse and downtown economic revitalization.
Okay, thank you so much. We have Lily Langlois here. Yes, from the Planning Department, and we have Jacob Bindliff from the Mayor's Office of Economic Development in Workforce Development on standby. President Peskin, would you like to make remarks and or introduce amendments?
Thank you, Chair Melgar. Colleagues, this has been talked about plenty and has received its due in the press, but I just wanted to reiterate that I think this is really a good example of what can happen and does happen when the executive and legislative branches are cooperating and listening to a wide array of community stakeholders. And I want to just put it in a little bit of context, which is that no news to anybody here, downtown, particularly the Union Square area, was under a number of pressures long before the life-changing pandemic episode, as online shopping and the changing nature of retail consumption was sweeping this city and the world. And the zoning that we have in that area was really based on a former time. And we had started a series of conversations in my office, and the mayor was having similar conversations with stakeholders in the Union Square area, and I want to acknowledge and thank the Union Square Alliance, Marissa Rodriguez, and former Planning Department staff Ken Rich for working with us and really thinking through how to modernize and bring that portion of the planning code into the era that we are in, to provide for more flexibility and to really rethink what Union Square can look like going forward. A similar set of conversations were happening as it relates to something that really is pandemic related, and that is the changed nature of office work, which, as we all know, in March of 2020, turned out there was this technology that not many of us use, which we call Teams and other people call Zoom, that has profoundly changed people's work habits. And while there has been some return to in-person office work, I think it is time for us to acknowledge that that world is forever changed. And so, no news to anybody, San Francisco now has about 20 million square feet of vacant office space in our downtown C3 zoned core, and we have opportunities. Interestingly enough, the planning code has always acknowledged, or always as far as I know, designated residential as a principally permitted use, but it was not the highest and best use, and so people rarely, developers rarely actually built residential in the downtown, which actually, while we had a remarkably lucrative, thriving downtown, part of what we found ourselves up against was a monoculture of offices. We did not have a healthy mix of office or retail. Part of this legislation addresses the retail side. Part of it envisions over time injecting residential into the C3. I want to be very clear. What this legislation provides are a number of incentives to do so. While it's principally permitted use and few people have adaptively reused existing buildings, although there are some cases of it, including down the street here at the former AAA campus that the Emerald Fund repurposed, the Shell building downtown, a handful of others. It was very complicated to do so, and the changes that the mayor's office and my office pursued, primarily to Section 309 of the Planning Code, look to streamlining that. But I want to be clear, this is not going to happen overnight. This is half the battle. It is still a complicated process, and there are many things yet to be worked out. And I want to recall the burgeoning accessory dwelling unit experience, where things that are not parts of codes but really are parts of regulatory structures, equivalencies, most of them in the land of the fire department and the Department of Building Inspection, are still going to need to be optimized. I want to thank Planning Department staff for their work, Lily Langlois and Andres Power, who I enjoyed working with, and my staff, Sunny Angulo, on this. And then we have a number of amendments that were suggested by the planning staff to the Planning Commission, which the Planning Commission in turn recommended to this body and have been discussed. They are, while they're not way substantive, they are substantive enough that they will require a one-week continuance. There was one recommendation that I did not take that I would like to speak to, which was a suggestion by one planning commissioner that the Planning Commission ultimately voted to recommend to us, and that was regarding the temporal nature of the legislation. The legislation as proposed by the mayor and myself has a 2028, 5 year from now, expiration date. The reason for that is this is an incentive to take advantage of these provisions now rather than later, which is not to say that this legislation will not be extended at that time, but I think we want to create a come down and get it now while you can, first customer of the day atmosphere, because time is of the essence as it relates to our challenges and opportunities downtown. The Planning Commission's recommendation was that we hold a hearing, or they hold a hearing. Anybody can hold a hearing anytime. The Planning Commission can do that at their will. We can do that at our will. I expect that that will happen over time, but no need to put that into an ordinance. But I in no way discourage people from checking in as to how this legislation is actually changing the world. There are a few other aspects to this legislation that you can see in the Legislative Digest, one of them having to do with streamlining signage, both in the C3 and citywide, particularly with regard to one of my pet issues over time, which is the restoration of neon signs, which I'm a big proponent of, and a number of other sundry things that are all set out in the Legislative Digest, including changing some showplace square zoning to C3. The planning, I can go through the amendments, and Lily Langlois can as well. I have them somewhere, but they're not up on my screen. There are, I believe, 8 of them, including expanding it beyond Van Ness, which is what the mayor and I originally proposed, but there are a few C3 parcels on the other side of Venice. So it would be expanded to Franklin Street. None of this requires re-referral to planning. There are a number of other changes, but the thrust of this legislation is more flexibility around retail and streamlining adaptive reuse of vacant office to residential, and I commend it to you, and with that would turn it over to Ms. Langlois from the Planning Department.
Welcome, Ms. Langlois.
Thank you. Chair Melgar, Vice Chair Preston, and President Peskin, Lily Langlois, Planning Department staff. I'll just give a very quick high-level overview of the legislation and then happy to answer any questions. So, as President Peskin mentioned, this legislation is really aimed at supporting the economic revitalization of downtown, and the changes fall into three categories: expanding housing downtown, diversifying commercial uses, and streamlining and simplifying the entitlement process. So first is the legislation would create a new section for the commercial to residential adaptive reuse program. Commercial to residential adaptive reuse would be defined as a change of use from a non-residential use to residential use. And to be eligible for this program, a project would have to be located in a C district, east of Van Ness and north of Townsend, could not seek approval under the state density bonus program, could not expand a building's envelope by more than 20% or 1 story, and would have to file an application by December 31st of 2028. Projects which meet this eligibility criteria would be eligible for a number of zoning modifications to support the adaptive reuse of the building, things like waiving open space requirements, bike parking, exposure. The legislation also directs DBI and Fire to create an administrative bulletin or a procedures manual that outlines standards for adaptive reuse projects, and this was discussed at the BIC on May 17th, and Carl from the Department of Building Inspection is here and can provide a quick update on that work as well. The second category is diversifying commercial uses, and I'll just give you a couple examples. So in the C2 districts, allowing for things like laboratory, life science, animal hospitals, all those uses would be principally permitted. In C3 districts, senior housing, residential care facilities, outdoor entertainment, those would all be principally permitted. Perhaps most significant is in the Union Square area, which is C3R. Non-retail uses would be allowed above the second floor. So this would be a big change for Union Square and one that is heavily supported by the Union Square Alliance. The legislation would also propose more flexibility. This includes pop-up activations would be permitted as a temporary use. In C3 districts, there would be no limit on the size of retail. So again, providing more flexibility. There's also a number of ways that this legislation would help to streamline and simplify the entitlement process. So this includes the requirement for a planning commission hearing under Planning Code Section 309, allowing business signs that are non-conforming to stay non-conforming even if the business name changes, expanding the list of features in conservation districts that can be approved administratively would be expanded. So those are just a couple of high-level examples of some of the streamlining pieces. And then, as President Peskin mentioned, this legislation was heard at the Planning Commission on May 4th, and the Planning Commission recommended 8 modifications, which I'll walk through. So the first was clarifying that a formula retail use would be principally permitted as a temporary use. This clarification would help streamline the review and approvals should there be any questions about formula retail as temporary uses. And again, formula retail is already principally permitted in a C3 district. The second change is amending the definition of flexible workspace to clarify that the retail sales and service use or the general entertainment use must be principally or conditionally permitted on the ground floor, as well as removing the provision that the use must occupy the first 25 feet and specifying that the use must face the street. This change would give a project a little bit more flexibility. The third requirement is waiving the TDM requirement for adaptive reuse projects. This legislation includes a number of zoning modifications that are applicable to an existing building, and the TDM requirement falls within that category. The fourth, as President Peskin already mentioned, is around the boundary. So the legislation would clarify that this adaptive reuse program is applicable to all C3 zone parcels and C parcels that are east of Franklin. As currently drafted, there are a few parcels that would be excluded from the proposed ordinance, and that was not the sponsor's intent. The fifth is amending the exposure control to clarify the intended meaning and to provide an alternative route to compliance. The current draft introduces the term expose exterior with, which is not found anywhere else in the planning code. Revising this text would avoid introducing a new term, simplifying the control, and adding another route to compliance for more flexibility for projects to meet. The sixth is amending the eligibility criteria to allow all eligible adaptive reuse projects to take advantage of the zoning modifications and to allow additions of up to 33% of the existing gross floor area instead of 20% and a maximum of 1 story. And this provision would allow a little bit more flexibility and support project feasibility. The seventh is adding language to require the Planning Commission to hold a hearing to evaluate the program. President Peskin just discussed this one, and I believe this is a recommendation that will not be moving forward. And then the eighth is adding language to clarify that a commercial to residential adaptive reuse project, which retains a commercial use above the ground floor, would have to retain the existing POPOs. And we've been working on language with the city attorney and President Peskin and have language to be included surrounding that. So that includes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll briefly turn it over to Carl with Department of Building Inspection to give a quick update on where that work stands.
And Madam Chair, just before, I just wanted to say I've circulated those amendments to you, and they are in your email inbox. And just as to Lily's last point, this would be on page 18 at line 8, which is a subsection 10 that reads as follows: preservation of privately owned public open spaces. Nothing in this section 210.5 is intended to modify, alter, or waive the applicability of section 138, which is the POPO's provision, to commercial to residential adaptive reuse projects that retain non-residential uses. Sorry about that. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you, Chair Melgar, Supervisors. I'm Carl Nacita, Legislative Affairs Manager for the Department of Building Inspection, and I am joined today by Deputy Director for Permit Services, Neville Pereira, to answer any questions you may have. I'm just going to provide a really brief update from the Building Inspection Commission. The Commission heard the file at its May 17th meeting and unanimously adopted recommendation of approval of the Building Code Amendment in this ordinance, which directs the building official and fire official to develop an alternative building standards manual, which would provide the building standards applicable to commercial to residential adaptive reuse projects. At its meeting, the Commission also considered a number of specific recommendations from the department's Code Advisory Committee, all of which we're getting a little ahead of the enabling legislation before you today, but will be very helpful in the development of the department's adaptive reuse manual. So I wanted to make note of the preliminary work as well as the ongoing work to identify what may be included. And that process to develop the manual will be a public process through our Code Advisory Committee, as well as the Building Inspection Commission and outreach to stakeholders. Neville and I are happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, Supervisor Preston.
Thank you, Chair Melgar. I just was curious to hear the thinking on the exempting the adaptive reuse projects from the transportation demand management, which I understand is the subject of the amendments, and the bike parking, and it just would love to hear a little more about the thinking on that, because those things, especially because as we go to residential, in some ways it seems like the transportation issues, potential bike parking could be more needed, might be my initial reaction, but I'm interested to hear more about that.
So two fundamental answers through the chair to Supervisor Preston. One was, quite candidly, reducing barriers to conversion. Two is based around the notion that these are extant buildings that had much denser human occupation as offices than they would as residential. So you actually had higher transportation demand and higher bicycle demand when they were occupied at, I don't know whether it is 1 per 150 feet as compared to residential at probably 2 or 3 times that density. But these are all existing buildings, whereas in our current regulatory legal schemes, we demand those out of new construction. Here, basically what we're saying is, yeah, we want you to convert, and we are trying to reduce the costs and barriers. And that's what that's what all of the changes to 309 are really around. I will say, interestingly enough, as the mayor's office and my office were working in parallel and merged, and this is just one of these fascinating little things that is of interest to nobody but me, mine was actually had less barriers to entry than the mayor's. The mayor actually proposed to keep the bicycle parking in. Neither one of us had the TDM. I think we just both missed it. But I was the one who said reduce all barriers to the maximum extent possible.
And through the chair, thank you, President Peskin. Is the TDM issue the delay of doing the kind of analysis that's needed, or is it the concerns? Because I do think there's a big shift. I hear your point of there's more dense usage as office, but there are other transportation issues, right? Obviously for residential, including much higher prevalence of delivery vehicles, TNCs, sort of all times of day and night, and so it just raises, I just want to make sure we're not losing that by excluding them, and I don't know, maybe there are other protections in place to make sure that we're not going to be massively increasing congestion around these sites at new hours of the day.
I will defer to Ms. Langlois from the Department of Planning.
So there's a little bit on the process side that feels helpful to waive this requirement. So they have to submit an application, there's a site inspection that happens, and then there's ongoing monitoring that happens throughout the project. So removing those barriers is sort of helpful to help streamline the project itself. I think the other thing that we've been thinking about is that many of these buildings might not have a garage. So things like waiving bike parking makes a lot of sense. There's nowhere to put the bike. And same with many of these buildings might not even have parking on site. And so TDM ordinance was intended to help reduce the number of vehicles, the number of trips that were going to that location.
I may also just add this, and this is my untested belief because we haven't passed this legislation yet, but my assumption is that office buildings with large floor plates are least likely to lend themselves to residential conversion. It is actually the smaller historic building typologies that are more ripe for conversion. Having said that, everything is a function of money and depends on who bought what building when. And if you bought it at, some ridiculous amount of money of $2,000 a square foot, and you're probably never going to convert it to residential until the capitalist cycle of grief has concluded and somebody's given the keys back and it comes back out on the market at several $100s a square foot. But the fundamental notion here is that the older, smaller, floor plate, lower in height building typologies are more likely to lend themselves to conversion, and those buildings are the ones that are the least likely to have on-site parking.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, President Peskin and staff, for putting this forward. I'm going to push back just a little bit on your initial comments that I think this is not half of what needs to be done. It's like a small drop in what needs to be done because, as you noted, our sort of downtown retail has been ailing for quite a bit. I put myself through college by working at iMagnin on Union Square, and I can tell you things have changed so dramatically. And remember, Macy's gave up the men's store, like 5-6 years ago already? It wasn't a pandemic thing.
And just I actually meant that as to the residential conversion.
I
all I
see.
was trying to do
Okay.
was to say to people, I just want to have realistic expectations, which is this is not going to produce 10,000 units of housing overnight. That was all I was trying to say.
That's great.
But on the residential side, my remarks were really as to the adaptive reuse to residential.
Thank you, President Peskin. What I was going to say is that I am hoping that we can roll up our sleeves and tackle the entirety of the area and make sure that we adapt it towards our present and our future, because it is about transportation. It's about neighborhood serving retail, of which there's very little in that, inside core about what we want to do with, the future of that area. And while still keeping San Francisco having its bread and butter as tourism, which it always has. So I look forward to making sure that this committee supports your efforts and that, the staff can sort of bring whatever we need to go forward into the future. So thank you, and thank you for tackling this so quickly and for your collaborativeness with the powers that be. So thank you. Supervisor Preston.
Yeah, just one other question, just for clarity here, because I know the next item on our agenda deals with fees, and just for my benefit and maybe the public's, as I read this legislation does a lot of things. I don't think it purports to or seeks to waive any fees that would otherwise be due, except to the extent that maybe someone doesn't need a permit or something that they might have otherwise needed and wouldn't have to pay a fee on that. But am I right that this piece doesn't actually relieve anyone of the existing fees, and we'll take that up in the next item, or am I missing something?
Through the chair, you are correct as to item 2.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so Madam Clerk, with that, let's take public comment on this item.
All right, members of the public who wish to provide public comment on item number 2. If you're joining us here in person, please line up to speak on your right, my left, against the curtains. If you're joining us remotely, please dial the numbers that are streaming across your screen and press *3 to line up to speak. Everyone will be provided 2 minutes. Please proceed.
Good afternoon, Board President Aaron Peskin, Supervisor Dean Preston, and Supervisor Myrna Melgar. My name is Marissa Rodriguez. I'm the CEO of the Union Square Alliance, and I am here to express my enthusiastic support for the Downtown Planning Code Amendment legislation before you today. The impetus for strategic amendments to our Union Square C3R zoning came through the Union Square Alliance's new strategic plan adopted in November of 2022. The plan emphasized the need for Union Square zoning controls originally put in place in the 1980s to evolve to match current realities of the downtown retail market. Specifically, the plan calls for 1, maintaining a strong retail requirement on the ground floor while offering slightly more flexibility in what uses are considered quote-unquote retail. 2, significantly increasing flexibility on all floors above ground so that residential, office, institutional, and most other uses would be principally permitted. We're extremely grateful to Mayor Breed, Board President Peskin, Planning Director Rich Hillis, Lily Langlois, and Planning Department staff for how quickly and thoughtfully they initiated discussions with us to craft specific changes to the code in order to increase flexibility and streamline the approval processes. The proposed code changes deliver exactly what we asked for in the plan and in fact go beyond by grandfathering existing non-conforming business signs, streamlining preservation-related approvals, and in several other areas. The package of amendments before you include not only Union Square-specific code changes, but also a large number of changes that would be effective throughout the C3 zoning district. Thank you for your interest in the recovery of downtown San Francisco. Yes, a first step of what we hope are many. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez.
Are there any other in-person speakers? Seeing none, we'll go to our public comment line. It does appear we have 2 speakers lined up to speak. Ms. Mendoza, can you please put the first caller forward?
Hi, my name is Ann Christie, and I'm speaking on behalf of SPUR. SPUR is a Bay Area public policy organization that seeks to develop solutions to the problems our cities face. SPUR supports the proposed ordinance from Mayor Breed and President Peskin to facilitate commercial to residential adaptive reuse projects. Downtown SF has been struggling to recover from the pandemic, and office to resi conversions are an important strategy for the city to implement to diversify and activate downtown. SPUR and ULI, with the support of Gensler and HRNA advisors, conducted a study to examine the feasibility of converting office buildings to residential uses. The study showed that the city's existing planning code and building code requirements make it difficult to redevelop an office building into housing. The proposed legislation is an important step towards removing the physical obstacles to conversion, hence Spur's support. However, there are significant financial feasibility challenges to conversion, and additional legislation will be needed to address the financial feasibility challenges to make it possible. Many other cities across the country have successfully created housing through conversions by providing significant incentives. Because current market conditions and interest rates are not favorable for attracting new investment in downtown San Francisco, Spur strongly recommends that the sunset provision in the ordinance be removed to maximize the potential for adaptive reuse once conditions improve. If the members of this committee believe it is essential to incentivize conversion in the short term, we believe it is better policy to tie it to a reasonable number of units created through conversion, something in the range of the first 5,000 units, rather than a rigid 5-year timeline. This type of policy has worked very well in other cities. We urge the committee to approve the legislation with the modifications suggested by planning staff and planning commission. Thank you for your work on this issue and for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you for your comments. Can we get the next speaker, please?
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Chris Wright, and I'm the Vice President of Advance SF, an organization made of the city's leading employers and dedicated to the economic vitality and livability of San Francisco. Over the past 18 months, our organization has worked with our city, business, and community partners to advocate for the downtown economic core to become a more economically diverse and rich with experiences. Advance SF would like to express its strong support for this legislation. This ordinance will help facilitate commercial to residential conversions and diversify commercial uses downtown. This is important to ensuring downtown can evolve into a vibrant area for residents, employees, visitors, and businesses. Downtown needs to evolve beyond a 9-to-5 business district to continue economically supporting the city and its residents. This measure will help jumpstart projects that can bring new life to downtown and make it easier to get buildings active and full. Allowing downtown buildings to be more flexible is a crucial aspect of ensuring it becomes a vibrant neighborhood that is more resilient in the future. Please consider voting for this legislation today. It's an essential step in renewing downtown. It helps ensure the city's recovery can progress. And like others, I would like to emphasize that this is a step in what may be a rather long walk, but it's a great step. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Let's get the next caller, please.
My name is Jim Chappell. I'm a longtime former board member of the Union Square Alliance and a current member of the Streetscape Committee of the Alliance. I own no property or businesses that will be affected by this ordinance and have no interest other than that of every citizen of San Francisco. I commend this ordinance to you. It is clear that the city has a large role in revitalizing the economy of downtown and other commercial neighborhoods. And I congratulate Supervisor Peskin, Mayor Breed, and the Planning Department for crafting this carefully thought out measure. Please vote to pass this ordinance on to the full board with your unanimous yes vote. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. We are checking, and it appears no more callers on the line, Madam Chair.
Okay, great. With that, public comment on this item is now closed. President Peskin, did you want to make a motion to adopt the amendments?
I note that Supervisor Dorsey's Chief of Staff, Madison Tam, is here and suggested to me this morning, I haven't even had the opportunity of running it by the mayor, but insofar as the amendments that we're discussing today will require a continuance until next week, and insofar as the amendment that Supervisor Dorsey wanted this committee to consider is not only substantive but would require re-referral. This would be a change to a provision that is actually was not something that the mayor or I touched, having to do with the Trans Bay area. That would change an existing threshold, square foot threshold in the code from 15 to 20,000 square feet. We could, and Ms. Tam can speak to it if she would like, but we could duplicate the file next week, add that and then send it on its way back to planning, as re-referral would be required to change that. But Ms. Tam is here. I don't want to put words in her mouth.
But Ms. Tam, would you rather duplicate it next week or now?
We can, duplicating today is fine. President Peskin, are you going to make the motion to duplicate and amend to add that amendment?
Amend it first and then duplicate.
I would not do that until or unless I know who benefits from this, and I know that this is being done for one specific property owner, and I have not yet been told who that is or what their motivations are, so no, I would not make that amendment today.
Okay, then should we wait until next week to?
That was what I was suggesting.
Okay, great
Right,
that we're
sounds good.
now having it on the record.
Got it. So the motion is to amend.
Yes, Madam Chair, Supervisor Preston, I would like to make a motion to amend as described earlier by myself and Ms. Langlois from Planning, which were the 8 amendments. You can see them before you. They are a number of amendments to the long title that describe the changes which are set forth on pages 12 and 13 with regard to TDM and applicability provisions on pages 16 and 17, changing the Van Ness to Franklin and the 20% to 33%, and removing the one vertical story. Dwelling unit exposure on page 16, and the excuse me, TDM and POPO provisions on page 18, a change on page 25 with regard to flexible workspace as it relates to the depth of the use facing the street, removing the 25-foot provision, which was a suggestion by Planning Department staff and the Commission. On page 30, with regard to the change from Van Ness to Franklin and the inclusion of formula retail, as long as formula retail is principally permitted in the underlying district. On page 33, that's the Van Ness to Franklin change again, and I believe that concludes the amendments. It does.
Okay. Madam Clerk.
On the amendments as proposed by Supervisor Peskin, Vice Chair Preston.
Aye.
Preston, aye. Member Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Chair Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. There are 3 ayes.
And then I would like to make a motion to continue this item 1 week as amended.
On the continuance to June 12th, 2023, as amended, Vice Chair Preston.
Aye.
Preston, aye. Member Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Chair Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. There are 3 ayes.
Thank you. That motion passes.
And I will note through the chair to Deputy City Attorney Pearson that the amendments that we just adopted will require a few changes to the second revised legislative digest.
Thank you, President Peskin. Let's go to the last item, number 3, please, Madam Clerk.
Item number 3 is an ordinance amending the planning code to exempt eligible commercial to residential adaptive reuse projects from development impact fees with the exception of inclusionary housing requirements, affirming the planning department's determination under CEQA and making appropriate findings.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We have Madison Tam here from Supervisor Dorsey's office, whose legislation this is. And we also have Lily Langlois again from the Planning Department.
Great, thank you, Chair Melgar, and good afternoon, President Peskin, Supervisor Preston. So the legislation before you today would waive impact fees on commercial to residential adaptive use projects, the same type of projects that were just addressed in the Mayor and President Peskin's legislation. Last year, then Supervisor Marr asked the BLA to conduct a report about commercial to residential conversions, and that report yielded several recommendations for the board to consider. one of which was delaying, reducing, or eliminating impact fees. And as my former colleague at SPUR mentioned, SPUR, Gensler, ULI, and RNA advisors have been working on a report around office conversions and previewed some of their findings at this committee some time ago. And one of the things in this report was a suggestion to reduce impact fees. This policy is the convergence of two things our office has been working diligently on: reducing barriers to building housing and revitalizing our downtown. With these two goals in mind, our office began to work with the planning department on this legislation. The department identified the fees that would apply in such conversions, and our office decided to move forward with legislation to waive all of those fees except for inclusionary housing requirements. Our office has engaged with developers, architects, SPUR, the Housing Action Coalition, and the East Cut CBD on this legislation, and we hope to have your support. We also want to thank planning staff and Supervisor Safi for being a co-sponsor. The amendments that are in the planning staff report and that I circulated to you earlier today, we will be taking those amendments, one of which is the same as the amendment to the Mayor and President Peskin's legislation, which is to modify the boundary to include C2 and C3 parcels east of Franklin and 13th, and then also to amend the eligibility criteria in Section 210 to allow all eligible adaptive reuse projects to take advantage of impact fee waivers and to allow additions of up to 33% of the existing gross floor area instead of 20% and a maximum of 1 story. So thank you, and with that, I'll pass it off to Lily again.
Welcome again.
As Madison mentioned, this legislation was also heard on May 4th, and the Planning Commission was supportive, offered 2 recommendations, which Madison just mentioned, changing the geographic boundary to be consistent, as well as the eligibility criteria, increasing it from 20% to 33%. So these 2 pieces of legislation talk to each other, so having the same criteria in both of them will be very helpful in terms of implementation, and we've been working hard to make sure that the changes are consistent. Thank you.
Thank you. President Peskin?
I had one other consistency suggestion that I did not have a minute to mention to Supervisor Dorsey, which is to the extent that we are conforming, as just mentioned by Ms. Langlois, the provisions around 33%, et cetera, to the item we just heard, I would also suggest that this sunset or be renewed at the expiration of the previous item in 2028. Presumably, if you extended one in 2028 or prior thereto, you would extend the other at the same time.
I will check with the supervisor. We are open to that amendment. Thanks for the suggestion. We've already been thinking about it.
Okay, Supervisor Preston.
Thank you, Chair Melgar. So I just in reviewing this material and conferring with planning, and thank you to Supervisor Dorsey's office for indulging our various questions. I've been trying to just get some clarity, and I think the public would benefit from some clarity over what fees are waived and what fees are not. Because like on first glance, it looks like there's this whole slew of fees being waived. A number of them don't actually apply to these kind of projects at all, but then some of them do. So I do have some questions, but I think it would just be helpful to get clarity on which fees would otherwise be triggered without this legislation by this kind of conversion, but will not be. And I will say in terms of the first one, I'm pleased to see that the inclusionary housing fee is specifically not one being waived by this ordinance. But there are some others that concern me, and I'll be, certainly the transportation fees right now. I think we are in desperate need of transportation dollars, and so that one sets off some flags for me, or at least something I think we need to discuss, and perhaps others. But can either planning or Supervisor Dorsey's office run through the actual impact in terms of which fees are waived here?
So there's 4 fees that the adaptive reuse projects would be subject to, and this legislation is proposing to waive. So the first is TSF, and the way that TSF is structured is that if you're going from a more intensive use, you are paying the fee on that more intensive use. So most of these projects already paid a higher fee for the office, so by them going to residential means they're not subject to a TSF fee.
And just to clarify, thank you. So it's only being waived to the extent that one were going from a less intensive office use to a more intensive residential use, and then it would be triggered?
So if you were going from residential to office, then you would pay the difference in those two fees. But you're going from office to residential, there's no fee.
So
because the office use is more intensive than the residential use per the way that it's calculated through TSF.
So why do we need to waive it if it sounds like it by definition does not apply here?
I think instead of listing, I mean, this legislation is very short, so instead of listing, I think, all the intricacies for each fee, it's just saying it's waiving all the Article 4 fees. So when we go in and we look at what fees are applicable, it's TSF, childcare, public art, and bike parking are the 4 fees. When we look a little closer, the TSF fee isn't really applicable for conversion projects. For childcare, you are still subject to the childcare fee, though the rate is a little bit less than if it was just a residential project, because there's a lower rate for a conversion project that's already in the code. Public art is only applicable if you're adding more than 25,000 square feet. So if you are just converting an existing building, not adding additional square footage, there is no public art fee. And then bike parking, since that requirement is being waived per the mayor and President Peskin's legislation, the bike parking fee is also waived.
So I guess my mind's going to how much in fees we're actually waiving here, because it sounds like TSF is not going to apply to any of these projects in terms of increased fees without this legislation. The child care one may apply to some of them. The public art fee is
may apply if they're doing an expansion of 25,000 square feet, but the threshold for this legislation is a 33% expansion. So as long as they fall within that.
Got it. And then the bike one is being waived, but is, I think, characterized as a nominal fee.
The requirement is being waived, so the fee it would also be waived.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay. If there are no more comments or questions from my colleagues, Madam Clerk, let's go to public comment on this item.
All right, members of the public who wish to provide public comment on this item number 3 should line up to speak. If you are joining us here in person, if you are joining us remotely, please make sure to dial in on the numbers streaming across your screen. Press *3 to line up to speak. Seeing no in-person speakers, we will go to the public comment line, and giving them a moment. There are no callers, Madam Chair.
Okay, well, public comment on this item is now closed. So I would like to make a motion that we adopt the amendments as stated by Ms. Langlois and Ms. Ham.
On the motion to amend, Vice Chair Preston.
Hold on. Did
sorry.
you have something to say, President Peskin?
I don't know if Ms. Tam has been able to contact Supervisor Dorsey with regard to the one additional potential amendment of having conforming the sunset dates in the previous item to this item.
No, I have not. And then I would also ask City Attorney and Pearson if you could, my understanding is if we're adding a sunset, that wouldn't be a substantive amendment.
Deputy City Attorney Ann Pearson, that's right. It would not be substantive if you want to make it next
So
week.
the amendments before us are substantive, would have to be continued, so we have a week to figure that out.
Yep.
Right on.
On the motion
Yes.
to amend? Okay.
Thank you.
On the motion to amend, Vice Chair Preston.
Aye.
Preston, aye. Member Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Chair Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. There are 3 ayes.
Thank you. And I'd like to make a motion that we continue this item to next week.
On the motion to continue this ordinance as amended to June 12th, Vice Chair Preston.
Aye.
Preston, aye. Member Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Chair Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. There are 3 ayes.
Okay, that motion passes. Thank you. Madam Clerk, do we have any other items on the agenda?
That concludes our business for today.
Thank you so much. We are now adjourned.